I think it's really
do
easy.
have
Yeah, you're really pointing out.
I showed them where you were on a map.
How I can expand the idea.
But I think you're right, keep it really tight, and then say, if this works, then. Shall we start?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, welcome to the second in our series of workshops with the survey research, statistics, and psychometrics, or statistics, survey research, and psychometrics, depending on the day. We're happy to have you here, and we're very happy to have Dan Hoyt come back in the second part of this two-part series on getting ready for the grant writing workshop next, in about a week, a little over
17th.
The 17th. And so, excited to hear some more, and then we hope you'll come back for the rest of our series. You'll find it in the, there's a list in this little pamphlet that gives the rest of our workshops for the rest of the year. Thanks.
Well, good afternoon. Today we're going to just kind of follow up on the kinds of issues we talked about a little bit in the session last week. Again, very basic kind of orientation to structures and aspects of the National Institute of Health funding mechanisms. Today, in particular, what we're going to be doing in the outline is to take a little bit of a look at what the review criteria are for NIH grants. One of the things that's important to understand when you're ready to write a grant to NIH is that you do have certain kinds of components to your grant. In fact, actually, that's the second part of the talk today, is to go over what are the basic components, the elements that have to be in any grant proposal. But it's really important to understand the criteria as well, because the criteria are what the reviewers are going to actually be using to judge your grant proposal. And sometimes people get so focused on what does each component of the application have to look like, that they really are not going back and thinking about the criteria and how they fit in. And one of the things that I think is really nice about the workshop that's coming to campus on the 17th is they do a very, very nice job of talking with you about how, as you're working on putting together your research plan, how you have to both pay attention to the basic components or structure of the application, but how in each of those you have to be going back and thinking about the review criteria and exactly how you tell the story so that we make it easier for the reviewers. And one of the real strengths, I think, of this particular grant writing workshop team is that they really help you understand the importance of doing that and give you some very useful tips on how to do it. We'll talk briefly about the two types of submission mechanisms that are in place right now. You're at the place where you're starting to look at grants with NIH, and you're going to be caught sort of in the middle. For many, many years we've been using the HS 398, and now we're transforming gradually to the SF 424 electronic formats of submission. I'll speak a little bit to peer review process and what it looks like, and then I'll make a couple of kind of closing comments on funding. In terms of the review criteria, when you are submitting a grant to NIH, you need to be thinking about each of these categories. We're going to go through and speak to each of them briefly. But basically, the categories that if you end up at one point or at some point in time getting onto a review panel at NIH, there are basically these 5 categories that the reviewers are assigned to evaluate your applications. The reviewers are going to be specifically asked to talk about the significance of your application. They're going to be asked to review the approach, which is essentially a critique, a fairly in-depth critique of your research methods and design. They're going to be asked to talk about and speak to how innovative the proposal is. They're going to be asked to speak to the qualifications of the investigator or the investigative team for carrying out the research. And they're going to be asked to speak to the environment that the research is conducted in. So let's take just a minute to look at each of those. In terms of the significance, it's really the question is, does this study address an important problem? The aims of the application, if the aims of the application are achieved, how will scientific knowledge be advanced? What are the effects of the studies and the concepts or methods that drive this field? Those are the kinds of questions that are going to be important in terms of significance. Somewhere in the process of telling the story about how you're going to design this study and how you're going to actually complete this grant, you have to convince the reviewers that this is a significant application, that it addresses an important problem in an innovative way, those types of things. And again, as I mentioned, the workshop on the 17th, they do a very nice job of helping you. I mean, they literally get the point, and a lot of grant writing groups will suggest to you that it's not a bad idea. And having served as a reviewer, I would agree with them, that at some point, it's not a bad idea to have a sentence in your grant at the beginning of a paragraph that says, this study is significant because, and help the reviewer and say, here's why this is important, here's what I'm doing. The basic questions and approaches are the conceptual framework, design, methods, analyses, adequately developed, well integrated, appropriate to the aims of the project. Does the applicant acknowledge potential problem areas, consider alternative tactics? These are the kinds of questions that are going to be considered an approach. The approach question, we'll see in a little while, a major part of your proposal is the research methods and design section of the grant. And the approach is basically the critique of that section. And that is, when you're writing a grant, it's probably at least 60% of the main body of the research plan. And it is most likely 75% of the critique that you're going to get from your reviewers. It's going to be spending time looking at the approach. You look at a reviewer, when you see an actual scoring sheet from a reviewer, you'll see significance, and then you'll see 2 or 3 sentences. But when you get to approach, all of a sudden you've got 3 pages or 2 pages of single-spaced comments, because that's where they really dig in and say, is this going to work? Did they set it up right? Do they know how to do it? Are they going to be able to give results of the type that they're talking about by doing it this way? Innovation. Again, this tends to be more like the significance part, a relatively short, focused kind of question for the reviewers. But does the proposed research employ novel concepts, approaches, or methods? Are the aims original and innovative? Does the project challenge existing paradigms or develop new methodologies or technologies? What is it that you're doing that's innovative? You've got to be able to convince a reviewer that you're not just doing the same thing that 10 other people have already done in the last 2 years. They're looking for the research that you're involved in to take the next step. And so you have to help them understand what is it that you're doing that's helping to take that next step. What's your innovation? What's your contribution to the knowledge base and the potential contribution? Investigator. Is the investigator appropriately trained and well suited to carry out the work? Is the work proposed appropriate to the experience level of the principal investigator and other researchers? This is a question that sometimes is the hardest one for us to ask ourselves. And saying, can I get this thing funded? Am I at the right place in my career? Have I established enough credibility with the publications and work that I've done that I can take this kind of grant forward? And the answer to that is often variable. And understanding that's part of the mechanisms we talked about last time, the grant approaches. So that you might be, if you're fairly early in your career, have 2 or 3 publications in an area, you're starting to get yourself established, you might be in a very good position to qualify as an investigator for a small grant, an initial, like an R03 that we talked about, or maybe even an R21 experimental grant. Maybe less so for an R01, a more sophisticated, longer, well-developed kind of proposal. You might not be in the place to do that. But one of the things that's important to understand is that they talk a lot, they use the terminology a lot about independent investigators. And some of the best advice that I've seen given on this is to recognize that when they say independent investigators, they mean that you're far enough in your career and your development that you can carry out what you're proposing to carry out. It doesn't mean that you have to do it alone. In fact, most large grants are team efforts where there are multiple investigators. investigators, and you go out and you figure out who else do I need to bring into this. If you have a really good substantive idea and you've written in an area and you're pretty knowledgeable about it, but now you want to go out and bring in some new component that you've heard a little bit about, but you really haven't worked with, but you know that there's somebody over in educational psychology who's been doing measurement in this area. And we go over there and talk to them and say, would you like to work on a grant with me? Would you be interested in being a co-investigator on a grant? And that's the kind of thing you do. The other thing you do is you look for and you search out, very early in the process, experienced mentors. Find experienced investigators on the campus. Come to SSP, go over to the Center for Children and Family Schools, talk to people who've done this kind of work and get their advice and listen to their advice. This is a big thing where you have to be very realistic about where you're at and whether you're ready to get funded. And you can write a very good proposal, but if a reviewer says, you know, this is a brand new person, they're going it alone, I don't have any evidence in this proposal that they know how to do this, they've obviously read about this method, but I don't know that they can really do it. You have to be self-critical and have to be aware that that's the kind of questions that the review panels are asking themselves. In terms of environment, does the scientific environment in which the work we've done contribute to the probability of success? Is it, and it's not just saying, oh, I'm at a Research One university, therefore I have the environment. That's not going to cut it. You need to be able to talk more about how the proposed experiments take advantage of unique features of the scientific environment and collaborative arrangements. If you're doing a grant from here, there's a couple of ways you do that. One of them is there's a part of the opening part of the grant where it's called the Resources and Facilities page. You really need to spend some time thinking about what goes there. For example, in the Bureau of Sociological Research, we have sort of a standard facilities page template that we use that talks about all the kinds of services that the Bureau offers. So that if somebody's working with us on data collection, it's kind of a resume of the Bureau, and you see this kind of effect as you get into research, especially when you're working with more innovative research. You want to be able to say that I work at a university that has a very well developed infrastructure for providing technical support. So if I need some assistance on measurement issues, ionometrics, these kinds of things, I can go to the NEAR Center. And you might want to put a little paragraph in there about the NEAR Center. You might want to say that we also are one of, 4 universities in the country that have a PhD program in survey research and methods, and we have expertise there that we can that we can draw upon to help with problems. And that's what this is all about. And oftentimes it's not even necessarily having some of those folks on as co-investigators, but to know, like in your resources page and someplace in your narrative, to say, I've got people around me, I've got resources I can call upon. Now you should not only write it in the grant, you should actually talk to some of those people like you're writing it. And so that they can look at it and say, don't say it this way, say it that way. And they can give you some very sage advice about how to structure things. But environment is important. I've been on review panels where you listen to people talk and they get to a place and say, well, I've got some questions about this, but they're working in a really good place and there are people there that are going to be able to help them. I know that a few years ago when Les Whitbeck and I proposed our longitudinal homeless runaway project, there were a lot of questions, reasonable questions for a review panel, about how in the heck were we going to track this population over time, how were we going to do effective research measurement with it. We had a little bit of a track record that we could build on. But when we got our review sheets back, one of the things that was very interesting was that they said this is a very complicated process, and while this team has some experience, they're going to be dealing with some really tough issues. But then they also said, but it is being conducted in a research institute that's been very successful at gathering data from very difficult populations, and therefore the environment's going to contribute to the success of this proposal. That's what you want to do. You want to write the grant in such a way that they see the University of Nebraska as a good place to be doing this work. And that's a real important issue. Another part of that too is to take advantage of the resources. When you think back about both, it goes back a little bit to the previous question on investigators. let's say you've got a lot of experience right in an area, you know a lot about it, but you've never gathered data before. You've never gone out and done interviews. Don't decide that, hey, I can just gather some data. I've heard about SurveyMonkey, and I can put together a survey on the internet, and I can get some data, and that's how I'll do it. There's a lot of problems with that. And you know, what you want to do is you want to go to some place, like take advantage of the fact that we have SSP. Come over here and say, I need to do this project. How should I gather my data? Do I need help doing it? Should I bring somebody in? Should I subcontract the data collection out to a unit? A lot of times, especially for new investigators, that's a smart thing to do. Because then what you've done is you've gained the credibility of years and years of experience that come out of that particular unit. And they know then that you're going to be getting advice from people who've been down this path before. Now, when you actually write the proposal, what you're going to be actually looking at in terms of your research plan, the main part of the research plan, the body of the grant, is are basically 4 sections: specific aims, background and significance, preliminary studies, or progress report. Progress report really only applies if you're doing a resubmission. So basically what we're going to talk about is preliminary studies. And then research design and methods. Under most mechanisms, for example in R01, these 4 elements, A through D, are a maximum of 25 pages. Sometimes with certain mechanisms like the R03s, under certain agencies, they can be 15 pages or even 10 pages. This is really the place where you have to tell most of your story. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about the specific elements of these in a minute, but it's important to understand that when you send in a grant application, it's not a 25-page document. I think, oftentimes you're going to be sending in a grant application that's, if you're doing a very large-scale grant, I think one of the last ones we did was something like 300 pages that we submitted. But in the middle of that 300 pages was 25 pages of a research plan. And if your research plan goes over 25 pages, it'll get sent back to you. If you print it in too small a type font, trying to get more content into 25 pages, if you don't pay attention to the margins, if you make your tables too small to read, it'll get sent back to you. If you try to be tricky, and in the process of writing the 25 pages, reference, see this document in Appendix B to explain my methodology, the reviewers are going to dock you. And in fact, only the 3 primary reviewers, the primary, secondary, and tertiary reviewers, will actually see the appendices that come with your proposal. The rest of the reviewers of the panel won't see those, and they won't have advantage of them. Everything that's essential to getting your proposal approved has to be at least 25 pages. And that is a very painful process sometimes to limit yourself to that. But it's an important thing that I recognize. But there's a lot of other stuff that goes on in terms of a proposal. You're going to have to have cover sheets, budget pages. You're going to have a lot of things that I'm not going to speak to today, but they're really easy to learn about. Things like bio sketches, or essentially short, no more than 3-page kind of biographical summary, sort of a Vita-like document with a very specific format for each of the key personnel in the project. Like I mentioned before, a resource page. Depending on how you're doing the budgeting, it may be a very complex budget with a very complex budget area that may be shorter. But then after this, you do have a human subject section. It's mandated. There are a lot of important questions you have to answer. I'm not going to speak to those today. That may be a session that we do later on sometime. But there's a lot of attention you need to pay to the federal regulations. What you have to understand is that what you're doing here on a campus with an IRB changes when you're dealing with the feds. Children at the federal level are age 21 or younger. In a federal grant, you have to describe, do you have children in your study? And if you don't have children in your study, you have to explain why. Do you have women in your study? If you don't have women in your study, you have to explain why. Do you have minority representation in your study? If you don't, you have to explain why. So you have to address, there's a series of questions that have to be addressed in the human subject section, as well as the basic stuff that you have to address with the local IRB in terms of what are your protections, what are you going to be doing. If you have vertebrate animals, those kinds of things have to be addressed at some point in time. Then after that, usually are your references. So your references are not in the body of your 25 pages. And then supporting documents, appendices, and so on. This is the basic format that a proposal is going to have to be in, whether or not it goes in on the paper and pencil format or whether it goes in on the electronic format. Let's talk a little bit about each of these sections. The specific aims is the hardest part to write. Specific aims are designed, they actually are constrained to basically be one page. Some people, sneak over. You can go a page and a half if you really have to. But the idea is it's supposed to be a very, very short, concise presentation of your basic research idea, why it's important, what you should do, what you would propose to accomplish. And you would literally, at some point in time, say specific aim number 1, specific aim number 2, specific aim number 3. As mentioned here, not a dozen. You don't want to suggest that you're going to try to do too many things. And that whatever things you're doing should be systematically interrelated. But interrelated in a way that they're not sort of a conditional chain. So that, you don't want to have it be that, well, I'm going to first go out and conduct this pilot study. And when I find this, then I will build on it. The reviewers are going to look at it and say, well, what if you don't find it? Then you can't do aims 2 and 3. So you want to think very logically about what it is you're proposing to do and how you're proposing to do it. This is where, I sound like I'm plugging it too much, but I think that they were particularly good. One of the real strengths of the workshop that's here on the 17th is they're very good about helping you think about structuring specific aims. In fact, the Morrison group actually has very specific, here's what your first paragraph should look like, here's what your first sentence should look like. And they make it, I think if I'm remembering the talk right, they'll start off by talking about how the first sentence should make the point of how this is important. The second 2 or 3 sentences ought to make the point about what do we know about this important topic. And then the final sentences in the opening paragraph ought to identify what is the existing gap or the next logical step in developing knowledge in this area and how can, and then essentially say, and that's what we're going to do. And then you go to the second paragraph where you kind of build in the next part, and they really do a nice job of helping you think about how do you structure that. And even to the point of structuring it so you get to the end of it and you're kind of saying, and the reason it should be done by us is so-and-so. So you make the point for facilities and match the investigator with the idea. But it's very short. Of the 25 pages, 1 page. But it's the critical page. This is what the reviewers are going to go to first. If a reviewer, I can tell you from having done 40 or 50 reviews over the last few years, well, not that many panels, but probably at least reviewing 40 or 50 proposals. If you don't understand exactly, at least in a general sense, obviously, but if you don't understand exactly what the investigator wants to do when you finish reading that page, you're not going to evaluate the proposal positively. It's got to be succinct, to the point, and clear to the reviewers. The next part of it is the background and significance section, and the purpose there is to convince the reviewers you understand the research questions in the larger scientific context. You need to let the reviewers know that you understand the problem, but you don't want to make this a bibliographic lecture or describe individual studies in detail. In fact, what you want to do is focus a lot more on what don't we know, where are the gaps, where are the conflicts in the literature. You want to set up the theoretical and conceptual framework for your research. Oftentimes, your literature review is going to lead to some kind of a theoretical model that you actually want to lay out to your readers. It provides the basic scientific rationale and justification for your research. The preliminary studies, the purpose of it is to show the reviewers that you and your team have experience doing research and basically can get this done, be good stewards of public research funds. What are your previously published analyses or pilot work that's directly related to the project? Here you want to think of it very logically about making the point of we've done this preliminary work in this area. And here you're actually probably going to be pulling in things from your previous published articles and saying, we've done this kind of analysis, we've learned this, we've been working with this kind of population for 5 years now, and here's what we've learned. If you're less experienced, if you're a newer investigator, it may be just more about, I have this training, I have this background, and here's evidence that I have an interest in this area, and I'm working toward it. And I have these other people that I'm bringing into my team who are going to help me. And so especially if you've done some stuff but you haven't done other things, then you bring in co-investigators and say, and then I'm going to bring in Dr. So-and-so, and they're going to help me with this part of it. And they have an expertise in this area. What a preliminary studies looks like varies greatly from project to project. If you're dealing with R03s, for example, beginning, work of young investigators, oftentimes we understand that there's not going to be much more there than showing that they have some training and experience and have started their careers in a direction that's consistent with a proposal. If you're going in for an R01, then you really need to show that this research team's already been working in this area, has been publishing in this area, has the skills necessary to do everything they say they're going to do. And you see it built, you can see them built in a lot of ways. There's no one way to write a preliminary study section, but you have to convince people that this is kind of consistent with where you're going. But the hardest part, and like I say, probably about, there's not really good, fast guidelines for the links to some of the other sections. I've heard a lot of people say that you should have 3 or 4 pages background of significance, 3 or 4 pages preliminary studies, and then the bulk of it, somewhere from 10 to 15 pages of that 25 pages should be the research design and methods. And here what you're trying to do is to convince your reviewers that you've completely thought through how to answer the questions posed in the scientific aims section, and that you've anticipated any potential problems in your design and how you deal with those problems. You need to justify everything that you're doing. You need to justify your instruments. You need to talk about it. You need to say, I'm going to measure this by using this scale. And I'm using this scale because it's been found by so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so to be one of the better predictors of this and that. And, those kinds of things. You want to talk about it. And the reliabilities, you've done work with it before, report the reliabilities, measurement properties of the scales. If you haven't, try to cite other people who have. You need to, at some point, we talked about this a little bit last time, you need to justify your gathering data, you got a sample, you need to justify the sample size through a power analysis. Reviewer, I don't know how many proposals I've seen they get axed by reviewers just because people didn't do a power analysis. And they kind of go, well, how do they know 300 subjects is going to be enough? You can't just say, I'm going to have this number of subjects because my professor told me so, or because every other study that I've read in this area has used this number. You need to be able to make an argument that given what you're studying, the effect sizes that you're ready to anticipate looking at, how large of a sample are you going to need? And you're going to need to be able to make that argument in more than one way. So for example, you could have a basic set of multiple regressions that you want to run. And you can easily do some power calculations and say, well, I can identify, at a point, I can identify effects down to small effect sizes using Cohen's definitions of small effect sizes, up to 80% power with a sample of 350. But if one of your hypotheses, one of your specific aims is saying, I want to see how gender moderates this process, and all of a sudden, you introduce the complexity to the power analysis because you have to calculate power differently if you're dealing with moderation effects and how you model those moderation effects. If you're dealing with an SEM, you're going to split the sample, so all of a sudden you have less power. If you have, as many of us do, if you're doing, a lot of people on this campus do school-based research, or they do research where they are working with adolescents and they sample them through schools. You've got a nested sample. A nested sample has the implication of design effects and therefore reduced sample, or actually what we call reduced power, because your effective sample size is less than your real sample size. You have to anticipate that. You have to address it. You have to convince the reviewers that you both understand it and have made meaningful calculations so that if they actually fund your study and you actually only interview 350 people, that you're going to be able to test the effects that you say you're going to test. Most of us don't have the statistical background and expertise to do this ourselves. We go out and we find help, and it's one of the things that SSP does for us. And it's one of the places that I think it's critical. Don't underestimate how important this is. Every review panel has a statistical guru on it, and they're going to be looking specifically for that. And a lot of times people in panel, there are a lot of other people there that are not statistically sophisticated, and so they'll defer. And if you're not making that one person happy, your score is going to be affected. And so you need to, I know it's something we talk about a lot, but it's one of the areas where I see a lot of people, young investigators, making the mistake of not recognizing the importance of addressing that issue. You need to do things like thoroughly addressing the sampling approach and implications of it. Is the sample nested? Well, I talked a little bit about that already. Is there going to be attrition? How will attrition affect conclusions? You need to, if you're doing an intervention or anything like that, you need to do a step-by-step explanation. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Jim.
Oh, it's okay.
I was thinking something you said earlier in the context of what you were just talking about. I was wondering, let's say you do something really innovative. Quite frankly, it was actually around the point of the Colorado. Could you actually do a simulation to sort of justify your reasoning for a particular sample size, put it in an appendix, and then within the body, explain what you're doing, why you're doing it, and then say, see appendix, whatever, for greater detail about how this thing works. That would count.
That would count. That's a very appropriate tactic. In fact, you've seen that a lot. And you've seen with certain, and I'm trying to think about, particularly with some latent growth curve modeling applications that I've seen, there's not been a lot of work done out there yet. And there are, like within M+, there's some of these Monte Carlo routines. There's also there's some work that was set up a long time ago with LISREL and LISCOMP, and I think it was some of the work that, well, I'm blanking right now, Bentler and Benet were doing way back. And there's a lot of people, you've seen that in a lot of grants, where they'll run a simulation. And part of the challenge is, and it can feed right off your question too, is sometimes you don't know what's a reasonable effect size. If you're studying something where you're saying, we're looking at this, we've run into this a lot with interventions, and it's a brand new intervention, we're getting ready to test it. We don't know how effective the intervention is going to be. And so sometimes you want to run a simulation, you say, if our effect size is this, then here's our power curve, or our effect size is this, here's our power curve. And exactly right, you need to present the basic content of it in there, but I have seen several places where people have then said, there's a more technical description of the statistical assumptions and modeling that's taken place to generate these tables in Appendix G, whatever. And that's perfectly appropriate. As long as the basic argument is in the text, you can supplement it in that way. It's a very good question. I think that's one of the things that's always tough for us is knowing, and we often debate that, of saying, have we put enough into the body of the proposal to be able to address that issue? The big thing is it's almost impossible to imagine having too much detail about how you're going about doing what you're doing in a research design and medical section. Another thing that's really important, and we don't do this a lot in our work. I mean, when we write research articles, we get to the end and say, oh yeah, I better throw in that mandatory limitation paragraph, so that I can say, oh, my sample's limited because it's rural, and therefore I can't generalize to urban places. But it's still an interesting study. You can't be quite as glib as we are when we write research articles about limitations. You really need to acknowledge the limits of the methodology that you're using and address that you recognize them, and that you're choosing this particular approach over another approach, even though it's been criticized. Or you're saying, here's the sampling design, and it would be much better if we could do it this way. But we can't do it this way unless you want to give us $3.5 million more. So given the practical limitations, this is the only way that we're going to be able to get good data on this high-risk population and address these meaningful problems. And so you tell them right up front, yeah, we know that this is kind of an argument we have to make every time we ask for money to study homeless runaway kids, because they kill us on sampling. And technically, you can't sample, you can't justify any sample that you use with that population very effectively. And what you do is you say, this is the best approach that we can come up with. And we know it has flaws, it has these weaknesses, it has these potential biases, but it's the best thing out there. You need to be able to let the reviewers know when you've got those kinds of vulnerabilities, that you're well aware of them, that you've thought them through, and you've chosen the method you have as the best way to get at what you need to get at. Don't just use analytic methods because they're in the vogue. You really need to demonstrate that you know how to use the methods. If you have to use the most cutting edge thing and you don't know how to do it, that's where you go out and get yourself a partner who does. Or you go out and get yourself a consultant who does. It's better to have a co-investigator because people are much more believing that you've got a co-investigator, especially a co-investigator on campus, that person's going to be available to work with you. Second choice is a co-investigator off campus, and then be very specific about the plans to get together and use them and utilize their expertise. The worst case scenario is to bring somebody in with a certain expertise as a consultant. But I guarantee you when the review panels see that, they're sitting there going, okay, we know this person, they're really busy, and they're consultants on 47 grants. And they're not, and unless you really have specifically built in, okay, Dr. So-and-so is going to come to the University of Nebraska, once every 6 months and spend a week working with us. You're going to need to have that kind of detail in there to make sure that people understand that you're going to get the support you need. There's a few other things I'm not going to, I think I've said quite a bit about this anyway, but basically don't dig yourself in the hole and say that I'm going to use a method. And then without any demonstrated evidence that you know how to do it. It kind of goes back to the consulting too. You don't want to just go out and say, well, everybody who's doing this kind of work is using, mixed models and M+, and that's what we're going to do. And not have any place in your grant that suggests that you've ever done any preliminary work in this area, that you have any expertise in the area, that you have any idea, clue of how to run these kinds of models. One of the places, this is also where you strategize. I mentioned about preliminary studies. One of the things that we try to do in our work is, and I think it's a very wise approach issue with grant writing, is if you're going to say that you're going to use a certain kind of methodology, let's say that you're going to use generalized growth curve models in your analysis, then it'd really be nice if in your preliminary studies you put in a little section about, well, here's an interesting growth curve analysis we did with some other data. And then when you're in the narrative on the body of your research design and methods, you can say, oh, by the way, what we're proposing to do are to do growth curve models of the nature that we presented back in section so-and-so. And you can actually reference back in the early part of the grant and say, see, by the way, we know how to do this. We've done it before. The more of that you can build in and reinforce your ability to carry out the work, the better you are. The other thing I wanted to say about this as well is it's just really critical when you're going through all of this aspect of it that you are able to help people understand exactly how the methods that you're proposing to use link back to specific aims. It was a mistake that I made a couple times in working on grants where I knew why I wanted to use this method, and this method. But generally speaking, it's better to say, okay, specific aim 1 says we're going to do this. And this particular aim, there are 3 ways that we could approach analyzing the data to get to this aim. And maybe the first aim has something to do with more cross-sectional kinds of analysis. And so then you say, so to deal with this aim, we're going to do this. Or, like in some of our work, we have diagnostic outcomes. And so when we get ready to start talking about analyzing the diagnostic outcomes where we've got a dichotomous dependent variable, say, well, when we get ready to analyze the probability of people having these types of psychiatric disorders, then we're going to have to use models that are specific for diagnostic outcomes. So one of the things you want to do is make sure in your methods narrative, in your analytic narrative, that you make it very clear what's the link between a particular type of analysis that you're going to propose doing and that specific aim. So what you're doing is you're looping back, you're going right back to the opening page of that grant and saying, remember we told you we were going to do this, here's how we're doing it. Here's how we're going to be able to test that hypothesis. So make those links explicit, make them obvious to the reviewers. I've had grants where I thought, when we've just kind of done a general narrative and say, well, to accomplish everything that we said up front, we're going to have to do some logistic regression, we're going to have to do some SEM, and we're going to do some growth curve modeling. And then we demonstrate that we know how to do each of those. And we've been criticized because the people, from reviewers, when we come back and say, well, I don't exactly see how these methodologies link to the aims. Make it obvious to them. Show them. Tell them exactly what you're doing. It'll help you. There's other elements that are really important, much more important than people realize. Two of them are the title and the abstract. The title of your application, which now is better. I don't remember exactly how they've changed it. It used to be limited to 56 characters. I think now it's 80, maybe a little bit over 80 characters. So you can have a little bit longer title. And your abstract, which is basically a very short, there's a little box that you get about 1/3 of a page to work with, maybe a little bit more than that, but no more than half a page anyway, where you have to summarize what your proposal is about. Those are the two places that the review panels, when you're in the scientific review center, when your application shows up, they're going to say, okay, well, where are we going to send this? Which review panel is this going to go to? Now, occasionally you are responding to a very specific call, and you'll mention that in the cover page, and then that'll kind of send it off to a particular place. But most of the time we're applying in response to program announcements, not in terms of RFAs. And so the title and the abstract determine where it goes. And if you're doing something in the area of mental health, just the choice of one or two words in your title or abstract may make a difference in whether or not your proposal goes to an epidemiology review committee versus a intervention review committee or some other committees with different levels and types of expertise. And you can also deal with that, and they'll talk a little bit about it in the seminar on the 17th. You can write a cover letter that goes along with your grant suggesting where you think it's most appropriate that it gets assigned. But the title and the abstract shouldn't be afterthoughts. They should be something that you're very careful about, considering how they may affect where your grant ends up getting assigned for review. Budgets. Budgets are so much fun. That's another part of it that I'm not going to spend a lot of time on today, but you need to make your budgets realistic and appropriate for scientific goals. Don't pad it. Don't propose cutting too many corners. If you propose that you can do all kinds of things for very little money, the reviewers are going to look at it and say they obviously don't understand how much it costs to do this work. They're not experienced enough to do it because this is, none of us could do that for this little money. So you need to be realistic. People aren't going to fund you this isn't like bidding on a government contract where the cheapest contractor gets the bid. You have to have a budget that's not padded, but it's also, like I said, also realistic. Most budgets, it depends again if they're modular. If you're under $250,000 total, you can do a modular budget and provide less justification. But generally speaking, you have to do a lot of justifying on budgets. And I've got a couple of handouts here that I don't want to spend time on right now, but I'm going to go ahead and I'll just get them circulated to you. This is a mythical but realistic appearing budget justification. I actually haven't shown you the budget, but what I did was actually took one of the grants that I worked on in the previous lifetime and changed all of the names to protect the innocent. And this is a realistic view of what, for example, for an R01, the kind of justification that would need, and the level of detail and justification that would need to be written into a budget. Now, there will also be budget pages, there will be budget spreadsheets showing how it breaks out in categories, but along with that, detailed evidence of how you break it out. And one of the things is, you get a grant funded, even after you're funded, sometimes a program officer will call you up and say, I don't see how you got these calculations. And you may well have to send them your Excel spreadsheet saying, here's how we calculated interviewer wages. And if they come back and say, well, I think that's not consistent with what you put in the proposal, so we're going to give you X number of dollars less. You need to pay attention to budgets. You need to spend time with budgets. You need to think about it. So that's just one little example. Oh, by the way, there's some very good resources here from the post-awards people too. So once you get funded, I was at a workshop yesterday, actually a deans and chairs meeting where the post-awards people came in and talked with us. There's a lot of assumptions about when you get funded, that, oh, well, there's a lot of money out there, and now that I've got my money, I can spend it on whatever I want. There's a lot of federal regulations on what you can spend money on, what you can't spend money. And this little sheet here is just a summary sheet that kind of gives you an idea of some of the kinds of restrictions about things that can always be paid for off of a grant, things that sometimes can be paid off of a grant with justification, and things that can never be paid off of a grant. Some of the things that you might think are very, very logical typically cannot be paid off of a grant. Let's say you get a grant funded and you're the PI. You cannot typically go out and buy books off of your grant that are related to the topic. I'm not talking about going off and buying, romantic novels to read in the evening and try and relax. You could be talking about buying the latest, manuals or statistics books to describe the techniques that you're going to use. Typically, those kinds of things are not allowed as expenditures on grants. Computers. Everybody says, oh, you can get grants, you can go buy computers. Well, if you have justified the purchase of computers in your grants, and that's been approved, then you can buy them. But otherwise, the assumption is that where I talked last time about the indirect, the assumption is the indirect's going to be covering a lot of that. And that, as an investigator at a university, you ought to already have a computer on your desk. So if you want to buy the latest, greatest, newest, version of a desktop for yourself as part of your grant, you're going to have it written in the justification of why you need that beyond what you've already done. There are a lot of things that we just assume we could automatically run out and get that we're not going to be able to. Clerical support, secretarial support, typically is considered to be part of the F&A, part of the facilities and administration that's paid for by the indirect. If you're going to need extra clerical help to get your grant done, then you need to write the clerical person into your justification. The example I gave gives an example, some narrative for a clerical person, and talks about what duties they would perform. And if their duties are standard correspondence for you, they're not going to fund it because you should already have that support. You'd have to make the point that this is extra help that's needed because of the extra work and responsibilities that this grant brings in. So all of those are kind of important things to be thinking about in the process. The budget stuff is, we have great people here and pre-award, the office grant that over here at UNL that can help you a lot in learning how to put together budgets. Again, if you're doing data collection, the best thing to do is very early, get together with people like at SSP or Bureau of Sociological Research or other units on campus, and have them help you develop a realistic budget. What is it really going to cost to do this? Most of the time it costs a lot more to gather data than you realize. Most of the time it costs a lot more to do all of this stuff than you realize. Part of it is because if you notice the first thing on the budget narrative that I handed out was that you have to calculate if anybody you're paying, you not only are going to pay their wages, you're going to pay their benefits. Clerical support staff on this campus now, their benefit rates are about 40%. Faculty benefit rates are about 26 to 28%. Graduate assistant benefit rates are now 33% of grants. So that, sometimes you're thinking, if you're sitting here thinking, well, a graduate student costs this much. Well, when you pay for it off your grant, your graduate student costs this much plus 33%. And so those are all things that are really important to anticipate up front and don't get yourself into trouble thinking about what you're actually going to be able to do. Application forms, there are basically a couple of ways to go, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them because I want to make sure I get one or two other topics before we wrap it up today. The PHS 398 is the standard form. It's still being used for R01s and for larger grant mechanisms, but eventually everything's going to go electronic. There's instructions and copies of downloadable forms at this website. If you actually want to see what a completed grant looks like, NIH on this site has an example of a completed NIH grant, so you can actually see what all of the pieces look like when you put everything together. The new mechanism, oh yeah.
Oh, I thought you were going to talk about that. when are you discussing, when have you gone to IRB in the whole process? Is it after you submit the grant or before you submit the grant? Because you would want to be in a position where you propose something that you then cannot get through the IRB.
My advice is go to the IRB as soon as you can. If you can do it before the grant goes in, better. Or if nothing else, when you submit the grant, by that time you will have worked out all the detail, you will have written your human subject section. Go ahead and submit at that point in time, even though the grant may not get funded. Because here's what you'll get caught up on, and I've seen people have this happen, is they'll propose a grant, and they'll do this and say, well, I don't want to mess with the IRB unless I get funded. Then you get the call from NIH saying, congratulations, we're going to fund your grant. And we will release the funds as soon as you've provided documentation of your local IRB approval. And all of a sudden, we have investigators rushing around, trying, and sometimes taking 2 months, delaying the start of the grant by 2 months because it takes them that long to put together the application materials. If it's complicated, if it's sensitive, if it requires full board review, here on this campus, that means it has to be submitted by the 1st of the month. It gets reviewed in the 3rd week of the month. And so it's at least a month's time frame for a turnaround on a full board review. And oftentimes, depending on your timing, it can be 6 weeks or more, assuming you do it right the first time. The best thing to do is just, my advice is, it doesn't have to go ahead of time. You can get your proposal reviewed and approved. If they determine that the human subjects components that you have in your proposal are adequate, it can go ahead and get reviewed and approved by them and slotted for funding, but it won't be funded until you send them that IRB approval number from your local campus. The other thing about it is that one of the things that can happen to you with scientific review is they can love your proposal, but they can decide that they don't think your human subjects issues have been well enough addressed. And so they can put if any of your reviewers put a human subjects concern in, then that's going to block funding to your grant until you've addressed that concern to the satisfaction of your funding agency. So one of the ways to avoid it, one of the best ways to avoid human subjects concern, is to go to the IRB when you're writing the grant. Go ahead and submit your materials. Even if, one thing you hear from people a lot of times is, well, my questionnaire isn't final. So if my questionnaire isn't final, what am I going to do? You can submit the basic questionnaire to the IRB saying, this is essentially what I'm going to do, but obviously I'm going to have to refine it a little bit. And you can get a conditional approval. And that's good enough to satisfy the feds for the starting point. And usually getting that done early also means that the local IRB is going to point out things that are likely to be the same kind of concerns you run into. And I think I'm running a little short on time, yes?
Dan, it might not be all, isn't maybe an unusual feature, but if you've got cross-cultural work involved, and that also involves translation, and through working with another culture, certain things that you've specified and had okayed by the IRB for your English application don't work in the other culture, and all sorts of negotiations sometimes start.
Yeah, sometimes you have multiple reviews. Like our IRB requires that if you're working off-site that you basically have approval of those sites as well. And it may be approval of multiple IRBs, for example, if it's a multiple campus study, those kinds of things. And all those things you have to and again, the restrictions at the local level are pretty much, they match the federal level, or they were basically mandated to do that. So that's usually where, if you do what your local IRB needs you to do, you're going to most likely have met the requirements of the federal level. Because we would have the same kinds of requirements in place. We're mandated by the same set of federal regulations.
If it were a two-country study, problems, or even an even bigger one, sometimes the other country doesn't have an IRB and also doesn't do the things that the IRB is requiring them to do. But, it's...
But that oftentimes with federal grants, my experience has been that oftentimes those even though one of the other countries doesn't require those elements, that they're often put in place to unless an argument can be made that actually signing a consent form is going to put somebody at risk for some reason. There are a few other things that I have on here that we're not going to. You can look through in terms of the overhead, in terms of where it goes. One thing I do want to point out it's good to learn what a review is about. Go to this website when you have some spare time. This website has an example of a grant application, and then it actually has you read the grant application, you can download it in PDF format, and then you can actually watch this video of a mock review panel session and see it really is fairly realistic about the kinds of things that take place in a panel review. That's a very useful thing when you're thinking about submitting grants to learn a little bit about. There's some stuff in here about the scoring. I won't get into the scoring, but I did want to jump forward. Feedback, you get what are typically called pink sheets when the review is done. There were some questions last time about about awards. These are a couple of charts you can just look at the end of your handouts about how much, what percentage of awards, like National Institute of Aging, in 2005, the success rate was 18.8%. In the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the success rate was 21%. So you get an idea about how many applications they're getting, how many are being funded for how much money. I just picked a few selected agencies to give you an idea. And you can also look at it by mechanisms. Here's from the NIH overall, the mechanisms that are being funded, like R01s at about 17.9%, R03s at 21%. Just gives you a little bit of an idea of what we talked about last time, just to follow to a question that we had. But I think that I do have one other thing that I wanted to hand out to you. This follows up on the question that came at last session about people were asking about program announcements. So I just printed out I cut a lot of the extraneous stuff, but this is an example of a program announcement. In this case, it's a program announcement for an R21 exploratory mechanism. It happens to be one that's a multiple agency, so I think part of what you see is in this case that you could apply this to the National Institute of Drug Abuse or to the National Institute of Nursing Research or to other agencies. At the end, you'll notice that depending on what agency you're looking at the end of it gives you a contact number, a person's name, and basically these are the kinds of things you start looking at. It's going to give you, if they give you an idea, here's what we're looking for in this program announcement. Here's some examples of the kinds of things we'd like to fund. Here are the agencies that are funding under this mechanism, and here are the people that you should contact at the agency to start asking them about your ideas. And one of the things that really very, very strongly suggest you do is if you're working on a grant, is you consider developing a concept paper that's a sort of your specific aims and maybe a little bit of detail about how you might accomplish this, and then you contact the program officer. A lot of people talk about flying off to DC and meeting with a program officer. That's the nice thing if you have the money and the time and you have the concepts well developed. But frankly, you don't need to do that. If you find a program announcement like this, you look at the contact people, you get in touch with them, you give them a call and say, is there time we can talk? Or you email them a concept paper, a 3-page concept paper, and say, this is what I'm thinking about doing. I'd like to ask you to look at it, and I'll call you in a week, or you can email me back, or whatever. They'll give you feedback, and they'll say, this is a good idea, but we're not really funding this kind of work. But if you go over to this agency, or they'll say, this is really good, but right now people are really excited about this piece, or this particular element. If you could add this, it would really enhance the probability of you being funded. And these people they're actually there to help you get funded. And you need to take advantage of that. But I'm running over time now, so I'll stop. I can hang around for questions for a minute there. Otherwise, we're done, I think.
Thank you, Dan. Great. Just want to remind everybody that there is the big grant writing workshop on the 18th, or 17th. And then we'll be back here November 10th for a very exciting research panel. So I encourage you to look at your little handout, but we hope to see you on the 10th. And I think Walt wants to say something.
Yeah, I've got 2 announcements. First is, in a moment of lunacy, I agreed to do a generalized linear mixed model short course. It's a 1.5-day course off campus over fall break. And I've been essentially in hiding for the last week trying to get it ready. And I think next Tuesday morning I'm going to try to do a dry run of it in very abridged form here. So if anybody's interested, the target audience is mainly master's level people in statistics, but I would very much like to, if people can come here and want to sit in on it, so that I'd eventually like to have a version of it that I do for SSP. So if you're interested in coming and kind of getting the idea of what I'm doing, there's a new procedure in SAS called Proc-Blend mix, which in some ways supersedes virtually every pre-existing mixed model procedure. And so I will be talking about that. If you're interested, please come. We'll probably start around 9 or so in the morning on next Tuesday. Yeah. I'm big. Then Julia requested that I do that because she's going to be out of town later on in the week. Okay. The second announcement is that on Wednesday and Thursday, the Statistics Department and the Center for Math, Science, and Computer Education is having a guest to campus named Ralph O'Brien. Ralph is an old friend of mine. He's well known in the statistics community as one of the major players in the development of power analysis. So it's and he's going to give a seminar in the statistics department that's specifically oriented around that department, or around that subject rather. More interestingly, he's probably one of the leading thinkers in the area of statistics education and how statistics and allied disciplines make themselves mutually relevant to one another. His background is that he did his original degree work in psychometrics, so he's a kindred spirit. He's also done a lot of work more recently in medical centers, so he's got the statistics, the medical, and the psychology. And he's done a lot of thinking about how universities approach statistical education and how the fields intersect with each other. He's very outspoken about many of the things that universities do that are highly, highly counterproductive, and he has a lot of ideas to how to turn those kinds of things around. He's one of the best seminar givers I have ever seen. So the math education seminar will be from 4 to 5 on Thursday afternoon. There is a normal room in Avery Hall where it is held. I suspect, I've been talking with Jim Lewis, I think we're going to move it because the room isn't big enough to handle what I think will be the crowd. But there will be an announcement that we'll send out on the SSP listserv when we figure out what the room is, but I encourage you to come. If you see it and you don't know what it's about, that's what it's about.
When you walk?
Yeah. Wednesday afternoon at 3, and that will be in room 49 in Carden Hall.
And how would people get onto the SSP listserv if they're not on it already? Because I think there's some.
Actually, we could send it to the list of people that just signed in today. And so if you didn't give us your
Yeah.
email, make sure you give us your email and
Yeah, I
we
think
can send
Mindy
it to you.
handles that, but if we have your names, we can get them to Mindy and then she can take care of it.
And you're going to be in this room
Yeah.
next Tuesday?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, if you can send me an email about that too, I can send it to my class.
Okay, yeah, as long as we don't have 80 people here.
Okay, well, thanks. Thanks, Dan. Hey, Eva, can you turn off the light for just a minute? I want to see what
I had a
this,
couple too many.
turn off the light for just a minute.
Yeah, we have